Welcome to Name 3 Songs. I'm Sarah Fagan.
I'm Jenna Millian, and this is a podcast where we challenge sexism in the music industry and empower fangirls. Because let's be honest, fangirls knew about that band way before you did.
And if you stick around long enough, we'll also let you in on some new music the girls are already crazy about.
So, not only do we have a really big episode for today, we also have some news to share with you all.
We're going on vacation for a month because Jenna got a real girl job.
Ayo!
We will be missing from your guys' podcast timeline just for 1 month, and then we'll be back in your guys' feeds on October 24th with new episodes, so you won't get to miss us too much, I promise. But if you do, we still are going to be active on our Patreon, so we will still be putting out our Did You Hear episode, which is the news you need to know with a feminist twist, as well as our monthly music meltdown episodes. So if you're really missing us while we are gone, you can come and join us over at patreon.com/name3songs. And we do have 2 new Patreon members to shout out as well. So Shane and Annika, we are so excited you guys decided to join our Patreon community.
And we're still going to be hanging out on social. If you guys miss us, come say hi. We'll still be there.
Go throw us a follow. We're at Name 3 Songs on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. We'll still be putting up our content, so you won't miss us too much just in your podcast feed.
So with that being said, what are we talking about today, Sarah?
We're talking about slash fiction. I'm not going to even beat around the bush with this one. I am so pumped that we are finally talking about this because I feel like this is one of the most stigmatized things that fangirls take part of in fandom culture. People of all genders read this and write this. It definitely predominantly is women, but I feel like the stereotype is that teen girls are out here fetishizing gay men, and that is not at all what's happening. And so we wanted to talk about this today to give you guys some information about what this is really about and our thoughts and feelings on it. And we also have a literal fan fiction expert specifically who also focuses on slash fic, which is the coolest thing that I can ever say, that somebody is a legitimate expert on this. I never would have thought that there would be doctors and scholars focusing on fanfic when I was sitting on LiveJournal confused as to whether I was following roleplay accounts or real accounts of the band members that I was obsessed with.
So we are going to be prefacing it with some definitions in case you guys aren't super familiar on what slash fiction is. But just so you know, the guest that we have joining us today is Dr. Judith Fathallah, who is an author and lecturer in media and cultural studies, presently working at Lancaster University. Her research interests include digital and new media, fan studies, user-generated content, and some of her previous works have been channeled into books titled Fanfiction and the Author, How Fanfic Changes Popular Culture Texts, and Emo, How Fans Defined a Subculture. So she's super knowledgeable on this. We're super excited to have her, but just to give you guys some background info on what fan fiction and slash fiction actually is, Sarah, can you fill us in?
Sure. So I'm going to start this off easy, which I'm just going to give you guys a run-of-the-mill definition of fanfic. Fanfiction is literally just fiction written by fans that either is about pre-existing characters in fiction novels, so about Harry Potter or Supernatural or Sherlock or Doctor Who. Those are very popular topics, as well as Star Trek. People talk about different series and movies, so many things. Nothing is off limits. And also, this has turned into real person fiction where people write about real people and they sort of live out their parasocial relationships by writing fiction about these people. Most of the time, this is a completely healthy thing to be doing. It's just a way to sort of, as I said, live out parasocial fantasies or ideas or whatever in order to play out your ideas of who a person is that you really love and enjoy. It's really popular in emo music as well as K-pop, but we're not talking about that today because Judith's main focus is on the emo genre of fan fiction and slash fiction. So that's our main focus.
And I will say one thing that I personally learned, which is a huge stigma around fan fiction, I think, is that people assume it's all about sexual relationships, and that's not always the case.
Yeah. I feel like that's definitely a big thing that people think and assume, but a lot of it is very much just PG writing. There are fanfics that range in one shots, which are like 1,000, 2,000 words, to anywhere up to like 600,000 word fan fictions that take characters from Harry Potter and make them better and more interesting. Like, it's just
a dedication.
It's dedication, and it's honestly just people being like, these characters are good, but I think that the author didn't really see where they were going with this. Let's make this better. And it's just like a really nice way to like live with characters you love for like a longer time and be able to view them from that viewpoint of like anybody who's read a book or watched a TV show has read between the lines and created some sort of idea of who a character is, I think. And fan fiction takes that and runs with it. And I think it's really beautiful and incredible. But because there is that focus on the sexual of it all, because there definitely is erotic fanfic leaning anywhere from coffee house fic, which is like, oh, your two favorites meet in a coffee house and they have like a very cute romantic relationship, and it's very like meet cute kismet sort of situations, anywhere all the way up to like BDSM, like torture play. Anything you can possibly imagine has probably been written about your two faves together at some point. The craziest ships you can find. And so with that being said, as we said, we are focusing on slash fiction today. And so to give you a bit of background on that, Kayla Hale Stern gave us a bit of history on the site The Mary Sue in an article she wrote in 2018, which is about Kirk and Spock. Because if you know anything about fanfic or slash fic, then you know that it all started from Star Trek. And so basically what Kayla writes is that Kirk / Spock stories, meta, and theories have been traded through Star Trek groups since the original series started in the 1960s. So fans are writing this in fan letters and they were sort of trading this around. It was very much like a subculture. You had to know the right people to get your hands on this. But in 1974, a woman named Diane Marchant published a story called A Fragment of Time, which is recognized as the first ever piece of Kirk / Spock fiction to be published or consumed beyond a close circle of friends. It appeared in the R-rated Star Trek fanzine called Grupp number 3 in 1974, and the original series had been canceled in 1969 after 3 series, but its wildly dedicated fan base wasn't about to let their favorite characters fade into obscurity. And so they kept the ball rolling with letter writing campaigns, zines, and conventions, and their tireless dedication was a big part of why Star Trek eventually turned into a cultural phenomenon, which is just like so interesting. And this story, neither character is named in it. Kayla writes is that they're gaming in the use of pronouns so that it's never precisely clear in the text that it is two men having a romantic encounter. While the narrator of the story, who is being treated to some tender and then increasingly sexual caresses, is called he, she puts in parentheses, it's Spock, the second character's actions are shown as an abstract that doesn't require identification or else referred to as simply, quote, the other. And then again in parentheses, she goes, it's Kirk, he of the blonde head.
This is really interesting because of what we just learned about homophobia and the AIDS crisis. And so while this type of fan fiction would have been seen as like very obscure, very taboo, they're like purposely hiding it. So you only know if you know.
Exactly. And Kayla goes on to say that her intentions for this interpretation were hardly a secret because in the publication, she did include a drawing that she made at the top of the story that 100% showed Jim Kirk and Spock locked in an embrace, which I think is just like icon behavior completely. And so the reason why this is called slash fic is because the Kirk / Spock pairing was literally shown with a backslash between the two names. And so because of that, it was punctuating rather than being Kirk and Spock, which would denote like two main characters involved in the story. Instead, it's Kirk / Spock. And that was sort of the code word of, oh, this is going to be gay.
Oh, the evolution of internet culture, man. I also think it's really cool that it started with fanzines. Because if you think about, well, I don't know how many of you are like familiar with zine culture, but zines have like existed as a way for fandom to like express their love and interest of whatever it is for a long time. If you think of like punk zines, that's what first comes to my mind of it was a celebration of the culture. And so it's really cool that that was kind of one of the first ways this was documented.
Yeah, completely. And it's really incredible how this one thing that was really popular within the Star Trek fandom that also became popular within other fandoms and created just a subculture in and of itself of fanfic and /fic. So that sites like fanfiction.net or AO3, even Wattpad came to exist, where people were using these online publication tools to write mostly fanfiction stories. Fanfiction and especially AO3 are very well organized. You can literally put in the exact specific thing that you're looking for and it will bring it up for you. So if you're like, oh yes, I want to read about Pete Wentz and Mikey Way tickling each other for 3 hours, there will probably be a fic about it, and AO3 or fanfic will be able to bring that up for you. These are things where, like, if you are looking for something specific, you'll be able to find it. If you want to find something that has no sex but is romantic in nature, you can also find that. There's ratings, there's all these things. You can find any pairing whatsoever, as I already stated. So there's just a lot to it, and people put a lot of work into it because this is a really important part of fandom culture and an important part of parasocial behavior in a lot of ways. That makes parasocial behavior not as dangerous in the long run, I think, because people are able to act out their fantasies in writing rather than like creeping on Taylor Swift at her house.
Yeah, that's very true. Like you said, I mean, there's so many ways that, you know, writing fan fiction is like a healthy part of being in fandom. And today, you know, we're going to talk a lot about that, specifically within the emo scene. And then we're also going to talk about when things get too far. Is there a line where things turn toxic? You know, specifically as we're looking at One Direction with the Larry Stylinson of it all. What was once all fun and games turned into a sour relationship between the two of them. So there's much to unpack today. It's a really fun conversation. We're really excited for it. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. All right, Judith, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to get into this conversation with you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Throughout our research on lots of topics, your essay is Stage Gate queer baiting has come up quite a few times. So we're definitely excited to talk to you today about /fic, because I feel like this is a polarizing topic that a lot of people have read or taken part in, but also a lot of people have maybe been afraid of for one reason or another. And so I feel like it's important to talk about and to kind of destigmatize in a way, but also talk about how there can be some shortfallings of it. And so in doing our research, we've come across a lot of information about how this phenomenon of /fic has taken part a lot in fictional spaces. Obviously, Kirk and Spock are a huge part of this, as well as like the Sherlock fandom, Supernatural, etc. Even Harry Potter, there's lots of /fic pairings in those realms. But it's hard to imagine that if in the late 60s, early 70s, people are writing Kirk and Spock fic, that there wasn't also like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards fanfic making its ways somewhere. So I was just curious if you know if there's a discernible point in /fic/fanfic history where real people start being the leads in the situation?
Well, I think the first thing to kind of realize is that in the 60s, /fic in general was very much like a closed culture and a closed community. And like now, as you said, most people at least kind of know what it is, because if you go on Twitter, you've probably heard of it. And also, of course, thankfully, homosexuality is much, much less stigmatized than it was in the 60s. But /fic in the 60s was a secretive community, and if you want to kind of learn more about that, there's a book called Enterprising Women by Camille Bacon-Smith, which is obviously very outdated now, but it's like a kind of ethnographic journey that she took into finding out about that culture. And there's a lot of issues with that book. It's quite problematic in some ways, but it is a good history of, you know, / culture in the 60s and 70s, a bit late in the 60s actually. We know there was real person fic happening because it is documented in the 60s in those same periodicals that, you know, Kirk and Spock / was coming out in. And as you say, I would be extremely surprised if there wasn't bad fic. I'm sure there was, but it's kind of hard to document reliably until we get into like the 90s in Usenet groups, people like coming out on the first mailing list. It did definitely exist in the 90s on Usenet mailing lists, but of course, a lot of that has disappeared because the internet was very unstable and it was not like well stored, perhaps purposely. You know, I think even then, probably, you know, you had to know the mailing list and you probably had to know, you know, the way to get into it. And then in the 2000s, it just kind of exploded with LiveJournal and the kind of rise of emo fandom and related bands and pop punk, it kind of just like became all over LiveJournal, and that's when I think it started to get a little bit more visible outside of the fandom itself.
So from personal experience, I was like 12 on LiveJournal. My parents were like, oh, it's private, you're fine. And I'm like, you thought.
Yeah.
Because as we know from being LiveJournal users, there's tons of communities and all that stuff. There's a lot more to it than just writing a journal that your like friends can see by locking it to friends only. And there are so many subcultures of fanfic and /fic on LiveJournal, at least from my memory of it. I just remember there were even people who would essentially cosplay as these people, where they would make fake accounts where they would play as being like Brendan and Ryan Ross, because that was like my ship as a child. I was like, these two men are in love and nobody can tell me any different.
Yeah. And, you know, let's not forget, they did have LiveJournal accounts, because I'm old enough to remember that, like, their posts on the MyChem communities and stuff. And also MySpace, which in retrospect was incredibly unsafe for kids to be on. Like, that was the wild, wild west of the internet. But I'm old enough to remember MySpace accounts and some of the crazy stuff that went on there. But that is the thing about those sites, LiveJournal and MySpace, is that those bands that in the very early 2000s were just starting out did have their own like pages and accounts and interacted with kids. But yeah, people used to role play, sometimes making it clear that they were role playing, sometimes not. And you kind of had to wonder what were they actually trying to pass themselves on, because that would just be impersonation, which I guess people have their own.
I was gonna say, this is really crazy, because roleplay, when you're making it known it's roleplay, is one thing, but otherwise it's literally just like impersonation. Like, you're pretending to be someone you're not. Isn't that like identity theft? Like, very early stages of the internet, I feel like this type of stuff would not fly today.
Oh, definitely. But then, I mean, what would from the early days of the internet?
Yeah, exactly.
But it's interesting, actually, that there hasn't been a lot of study on people's motivation for role-playing that is actually trying to pass themselves off as different people. Because, as you say, I guess nowadays we just call that identity theft. But... And also, like, it would be super obvious.
I was telling Jenna before we started recording that, like, I followed Brendan and Ryan both on their LiveJournals because I was like, this is fascinating. Like, this is crazy. But there was a role play account that I was like, this has to be their secret account because it was so well done. It's just so funny thinking back to it. I'm like, wow, what a different time. And like...
Yeah, I was saying the other day, actually, to one of my friends, it's crazy how there's so much moral panic about kids on the internet now. And the internet now is so safeguarded and such a walled garden compared to what it was in 2003, 2004, and they were just like ghost sites everywhere, adults on MySpace pretending to be teenagers. I mean, and our parents had no idea what we were doing on there because the internet was so new at home. I mean, in retrospect, it was absolutely a different online world. I think we forget to a degree how different it was and how it looks in retrospect.
Oh yeah, and like some of the fakes were like very believable,
very convincing. Yeah,
like I had friends who thought that they were talking to members of McFly, and I'm like, we're 15. Why would Dougie Pointer message you on MySpace? Like, that's not happening.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so crazy, like, looking back on it, especially in regards to the fanfic of it all and the role playing of it all and all those things that were happening, because I think a lot of those people didn't think that they were causing any harm in a lot of those points, but they were also reaching out to real people on the internet and in order to like continue their like role play game, but sometimes it just wasn't clear. It's so wild, because I was saying to Jenna that there's just so much that was kind of unpacking itself in my brain while reading this stuff, where I can't remember what we were talking about the other day, but I had a moment where my brain remembered McFly/fic, and that this was something that I had buried away in my subconscious of something that, because like I don't remember reading it so much as coming across it on the LiveJournal communities that I was part of just like really homoerotic drawings of like Tom Fletcher and Harry Judd having sex. And I was like 15, and I was like And my brain literally just like was like, here, look at this, and I fully just like saw the drawing in my brain as if like it was 15 years ago, and I'm sitting on LiveJournal like clicking on like a read more link, expecting like mood icons, and instead it's just like a homoerotic drawing.
Yeah, full on. Yeah, I remember being young enough to feel like I was doing something vaguely wrong, and you know, and that, you know, if anybody knew what I was doing, there would be some kind of terrible consequences when you what I was looking at. Which now, as an academic, like, who's been studying fan culture for over 10 years now, it just seems so bizarre that I would have felt that way. But, you know, it did feel like a secret that if people knew, you know, what you were engaging with, there would be some kind of terrible and shameful consequence. But yeah, but of course, part of that is that, you know, we forget how homophobic people openly were in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, Jenna and I have called up the context a fair amount of times about how, especially, we forget that most of the people, other than Panic at the Disco, that were popular in that pop punk emo sort of thing with like My Chem and Fall Out Boy, they were older than a lot of the bands that you would like when pop punk became more mainstream. Those bands started becoming closer in age to the listeners, whereas like Pete and Gerard were like 15-ish years older than a lot of the demographic. And so I think that the mindset of that is that we don't realize that they grew up in the height of the AIDS epidemic. And that and all of the homophobia behind that. And so we've called that to attention in our episode where we talked specifically about Pete. But I mean, there is all of that homophobia that a lot of people, especially like the people who listen to our podcast, haven't really had to deal with because of gay marriage becoming legal and a lot of the other things that have happened over the past like 5 to 10 years just in pop culture, and who's accepted as just being gay is like allowed now, and like isn't something that is as scary as it once was, especially to these men who were doing things that now they would definitely be canceled for doing, but at that point in time it's like they're making something accessible that wasn't.
Yeah, Billy Joe Armstrong has talked about this, hasn't he? Because he said like not long ago that he thinks he probably is bisexual and probably always has been, but it simply would not have been done in, you know, the 90s in punk circles. He would have been absolutely ostracized, you know, for intimating that kind of thing. And that's something that actually that I talked about in the Queerbaity article when I was talking a little bit more about the idea of kind of a bit more in defense of stage gay, that we forget that 2004, 2005 was a different world in terms of, you know, the acceptability of queer affection, particularly in like hardcore and punk spaces. And there were risks to this. Like, I remember when MCR was bottled at Reading, you know, and people were shouting like, you faggots and this kind of stuff. Like, there was a risk to this kind of performativity, and we forget, you know, because, well, I think some people forget. And, you know, some people just haven't grown up in the same culture. You know, a lot of kids now, I mean, it's 2021, isn't it? How did that happen? They were like, maybe some of them weren't born.
Right?
Yeah, there's that. So you just mentioned kind of this early emo scene in the mid-2000s, which really kind of stemmed from the very political, very punk, very hyper-masculine environment. And we see with emo a lot, I think as you said, it's not that they were necessarily feminists, but they were more like, they were challenging those very hegemonic masculine roles and leaning into the more quote-unquote feminine side, a quote-unquote your emotions being feminine, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so do you think that because it was like this reaction to punk, because it was them being more in tune with their emotional side, that kind of led them to lean all the way in, going towards stage gay and everything else?
Well, I think that there is definitely a kind of political impetus behind early stage gay, and like some of the bands have been quite explicit about that. There is a rebellion against the kind of all rage, all macho, sometimes racist like excesses of the punk and hardcore scene. But I think as well you're quite right to the we shouldn't like confuse this with feminism, because Sam Du Bois, he's that author who uses the term beta male misogyny, which I think is quite astute in talking about a lot of emo lyrics and emo performativity, that, you know, the masculine subject is still very much like the center of everything, and girls are just usually like a source of pain and suffering, and there's also this thing which is kind of inherited from punk in some ways, which is like, well, most men are Neanderthals, but I'm a poet, therefore girls only sex. You know, which is obviously in its own way kind of toxic. So yeah, I don't know if we can kind of attribute like individual psychological motives for whatever, for like performativity of stage gay. I definitely think there's a political impetus, at least behind early stage gay. But now, as I say, like it's a different world, and some people would attribute a much more commercial impotence to it because it's very sellable, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, initially I do think that it was quite a kind of strong statement and response against some of the hardcore punk scene excesses, which, I mean, like in the UK, the punk scene was kind of infiltrated by white nationalist skinheads in a way that was really damaging and scary. And there was like a backlash against that, like punks against skinheads or punks against racist or like skinheads against racism, and everybody kind of factioned off into these different groups. But I would say, like, initially, yeah, I can't speak for anybody's psychological motivations, nor would I want to. Now I think it's a lot harder to say, particularly of course because these bands are now a lot bigger and are on major labels and are not celebrities the way Beyonce is a celebrity, but much more commercial products than sellable commercial products.
This is one of those things that's so fascinating because it's like there were so many cultural things that had to happen for all of this to come together, for all of this to happen. And it's like it could only have happened at this point in time. Because this is a conversation Sarah and I have often of, you know, presenting yourself in a way that was formerly viewed as gay. For example, Harry Styles wearing pearls and nail polish, whatever. There's lots of people doing this now, not just Harry Styles. But it's like with these individuals and with Pete Wentz, for example, like, was this a political motive or was it anti-establishment? Was it like, hey, you know, kind of like a middle finger to the big man? Or was it them exploring their identity authentically? But within the context of the emo scene, sometimes maybe it doesn't really matter because it was opening doors for so many kids in the audience growing up realizing, hey, it's okay to be different. It's okay to be gay. It's okay to wear eyeliner or kiss whoever you want to kiss.
I mean, Pete Wentz and Harry Styles, very different generations and different seeds. But I mean, I'm a discourse analyst. So when it comes to things like internal psychological motivations, like, one, I'm definitely not an expert. Two, I don't think it particularly matters. Like, I'm much more concerned with effects. Like, I think the visual statements and verbal statements have sociocultural effects that we can analyze, and I don't particularly think there's like a great deal of value in trying to mine out people's individual psychological and emotional motivations, you know? I mean, maybe a psychologist would, but you know, I'm not a psychologist, nor would I want to be. I'm in media and cultural studies.
I think also the conversation around that of emo trying to set themselves apart from punk music and trying to make a more safe space for more people, because I think that at the time, especially when you read into it, because I would have been too young to have actually experienced it, but reading about it, it feels very much like if you were anything other than a cishet white man going into the punk scene, you're most likely going to get beat up or people yelling things at you or whatever. I mean, and then emo sort of pops up and makes it more accessible for people who don't fit within those norms. It is just interesting in that regard, because also it feels like, as Jenna was saying, and also you, Judith, at that point in time, it felt necessary for them to kind of go above and beyond and be a bit outlandish in the leaning into this feminine idea to sort of be like, hey, if you don't agree with this, then you don't belong here. And I feel like there is a lot of discourse also online about how these bands, especially Fall Out Boy, because they are more in the mainstream right at this moment in time, like how they don't do that very much anymore. But it's like they don't need to. And so it's not so much that it was a lie, it's more so that Pete's job is done. Like, he can
to an extent,
do what he wants. Yeah.
I think, like, we should remember, like, there were anti-racist punk bands and that kind of stuff. Actually, Andy Hurley and Pete Wentz were in an anti-racist punk band that Race Traitor that had a few, like, magazine covers and stuff. It didn't really go anywhere, but that band was really literally just to make us, like, the whole point of it was just to be like, let's make an anti-racist punk band, which tells you something about the punk scene, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think as well that we shouldn't, emo is still pretty white. I mean, yeah, we know that, like, some band members are biracial or South American or mixed, but, like, just even, like, at a visual level, like, visually speaking, emo is pretty much dominated by white men.
Oh, yeah.
Or at least white passing. So I think we shouldn't, like, overestimate. I think that it's much more, I don't want to say radical anymore, or, okay, I think it was much more radical in terms of gender politics and sexual politics than it was in terms of either race or feminism.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. And I feel like that's also why the other issues get overshadowed so much, because it's like, oh, well, look how much we did for like gender nonconformingness in the scene and how much like that's been accepted now. And it's like, now men just use that to gaslight women.
I've always said that emo was better for gender non-conforming boys than it was for women and girls.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So bringing it around to the slash fictionness of it all, there's so many layers to this. Okay, so we have boys kissing boys on stage, boys wearing skinny jeans, wearing eyeliner, Pete being on the cover of like the Gay Out magazine, but also saying he's straight.
But I'm not gay. Yeah, yes. Exactly.
And then them acknowledging slash fiction in interviews and like kind of making a joke out of it, kind of egging it on. Are they perpetuating these fantasies essentially within slash fiction?
Who exactly? The industry, the artists?
The artists.
Like, I would say, yeah, to an extent, but I'm not sure that has anything more to do with sexual politics than it does with just media convergence in general. Because I think that the way that the media industry engages with fan culture has changed so completely from crappy attempts to censor and ban it, which never were going to work, to acknowledging it with some kind of distance, to engaging and monetizing it, which is what is happening now, and just ignoring the bits I didn't really like. That I kind of see it as, if you like, encouragement of fan productivity is kind of just another form of media convergence. So I think, it is encouraging, but I don't know if that is to do with sexual politics. It might be more to do with industry and fan convergence in general and media convergence in general. Now, what the effects of that are in terms of sexual politics doesn't really make, like I said, motivations don't really change the effects. So maybe it is maybe it is a good thing in terms of sexual politics. So I guess my answer would be yes, with a caveat to probably not read too much into it in terms of gender politics.
I think it is interesting because we do talk a lot about these artists' relationship with the media and the media's relationship with these artists. But I think that in regards to the way the media sometimes will latch on to things that they find because they're like, oh, this will be a way to get this artist on more rocky ground to get stuff out of them, it feels like. And so based off of the stuff that I have found in regards to like especially the like holy trinity of emo stuff and like how they would ask questions and sort of bait them, it sort of felt like they were trying to trip them up and get them to be like, yeah, no, this is fake, this isn't real. But I think that the bands were so aware that never really happened. But it is interesting in that regard because, as you said, like the media has changed and now there's a lot of like fans involved in journalism. So when they're talking about it, they come from a place of actual knowledge and not judgment, just more so of like, oh, I'm in a place now where I can actually get the answers I want. Whereas I think prior to that, when these emo bands were being interviewed so much and being questioned about that stuff, that it felt more like they were trying to pull something out of them that they expected to be there, but probably wasn't.
And actually, I fully credit MCR and Fall Out Boy for handling that really well in general, because I think that they could troll them right back. You know, and kind of be very kind of astute and funny about it sometimes, and not just about gender, but also just about like performances of masculinity in general. Like I always remember, I think it's probably down off YouTube now, but there's this one interview somewhere where the interviewer is clearly trying to like bait them into saying like, what do you do on tour? Oh, we like to do drugs and have sex with girls and stuff. And instead of like rising to that, they just say things like trying to get Dungeons and Dragons science team together and like collect all the Fellowship of the Ring memorabilia and things like that, just kind of as and like in a very kind of straight face kind of way, which I think probably at the time I didn't realize that they were like trolling the interviewer right back. And I think that's very clever and funny, and I give credit for that, to be fair. But as you say, like, the media landscape has changed. Now Dan and Phil are the interviewers.
Yeah.
So,
And so I think also with all of this being said, and I feel like this is a very much like chicken and the egg conversation where there's not a real concrete answer to this. But obviously, as we said when we started, like specifically the term /fic started with Kirk and Spock with Star Trek. And that is something that's very much reading between the lines in that relationship. Whereas in especially these emo bands, they are playing up with the gender norms and the femininity and all these things on stage. And so do we think that the /fic would have always happened? Or do we think that it became such like a subculture of fandom because these bands were already leaning into queerness in the way that they were?
Good question. I think probably the fact that this performance of queerness as kind of rebelling against the hegemonic masculinity of the punk scene, that probably did initiate it. But I mean, /fic only really happens, well, not anymore, but it used to only really happen, when I think there was some kind of subtext to read into it. That's where the term / comes from, by the way, Kirk and Spock, because like it was a secret, so they would denote it with a / mark, so you had to know what it meant in order to know what it was. But I feel like there had to be some kind of there's some old articles about this actually saying that the intense male-male relationship is fundamental to Western culture and literature, largely because women were not real characters or personas for such a long time. And Camille Bacon-Smith talks about this a lot, which was definitely more relevant like back in the 60s and so on. And her participants were saying, well, we have to read relationships into male characters because the women aren't really characters, they're just like cardboard cutouts, like they're not there aren't any interesting female characters or this, but now of course that's very much less the case. So maybe now it's more dependent on there being a deliberate homoerotic subtext there.
It's kind of funny that by historically the patriarchy not letting women have real characters and not really giving them airtime, they did this to themselves.
Yeah, they did.
They brought this upon themselves.
Shot themselves in the foot a bit there, I think. But as I say, now there's kind of an abundance of, or is there? Is there an abundance of interesting female characters?
Well, I think so. That's actually interesting that you say this, because I, as like a teen, I used to love reading. And as I got older, reading became like more of a challenge just for me to be able to focus and all that stuff. And whenever I would get really into books, it would usually just still essentially be like YA fiction books, because any adult fiction would always be very heavily into the sex of it all, but also just like very male gaze sex, which isn't fun when you can just go read fanfic, which is like female gaze sex. And I'm like, okay, I'll just read fake stories about these characters on the internet.
Female-based sex. Yeah, a lot of academics actually have talked about. There's a really early essay by Joanna Russ which calls /pornography for women by women with love, which is like, as you say, female gaze sex. And Camille Bacon-Smith hypothesized that women were unable to imagine a heterosexual relationship that was truly egalitarian, which is quite problematic in itself, and some people say that Camille Bacon-Smith really is just kind of doing a kind of soft pathologization of women, in that, why do we have to have all these kind of explanations about suffering? Maybe they just think it's hot, like, why do we have to have women as like these suffering psychological victims? But like her participants were saying to her, like, well, we can't write relationships between male and female characters because the female characters are too boring and one-dimensional. Yeah, and we did just say that emo is white men, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing, where there's all these tropes where we'll be introduced to a strong female character, but she'll have been the male lead's friend since childhood, and she'll appear just to die to give him personal growth. And these sorts of things, or even in like YA books that are even sometimes written by women, a lot of times you have the same check boxes. Like if you sit there with like a checklist of like, oh, how is the strong female lead going to be see, it's always the same 4 tropes with like a couple other ones thrown in there. So it's always very similar characters. Like Katniss Everdeen is kind of the blueprint, I think, for a lot of this. And then people sort of just went off that and were like, okay, how do we change this a bit to make it seem like it's a different character, but it's not. But also, like you were saying, we do have the thing where objectification of women is a huge issue, especially of teen girls. So they feel very uncomfortable being just even comfortable in their sexuality and in their like, well, more so in their blossoming sexuality because they are teenagers. And then as we grow up and like in our 20s, it's still that situation of unlearning the fact that we don't exist to be fucked. Like we can have the want to fuck.
Yeah.
But we're taught so much in literature, in media, and all these things that we're objects to be had. And I feel like a lot of what we've read and a lot of like my personal experience and my friends' personal experience of specifically being interested in /fic is it's like we're not being sexualized in those situations and therefore it feels more comfortable. But also we're so used to reading books where girl characters get killed off straight away, or girl characters seem strong but they're not really because everything that they do is still based on their emotions about a male character. And so you have so little strong female leads in mainstream books that then you go on fanfic and you have all these other people like women and teen girls who are frustrated with that and they write it themselves, and they use characters a lot like in the fiction stuff where they use characters that we already know and they just make them better, or they take the parasocial idea of celebrities that they like and make them better and like make it interesting.
I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses that, as I say, like the psychology side isn't really my area, but I do identify with this to an extent that for girls, teenage girls perhaps, who are interested in sex but not ready to have sex, it's a kind of safe exploration because it removes the female body that you project yourself into. I can kind of see where that's coming from, like thinking about myself as a teenager when I first discovered / that, you know, I was kind of old enough to be interested in sex, definitely not ready to have sex. So it was, in a sense, a kind of safer way of exploring it. So yeah, they could be. But also, I always remember how in a book by Henry Jenkins, he was interviewing someone who rightly said, but why do we have to do all this explaining about women's interest in / when men can just be into lesbians and it's never even questioned?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's because anything, and like this is literally like the backbone of why we even made this podcast, of like anything women or girls like or have interest in is automatically judged and questioned and discussed ad nauseum. And it's never really discussed by those women. It's a lot of times just discussed by men or by women who aren't part of those subcultures. And so we try and have the conversations about things that we personally have read or have interest in or like and have been judged for. And I just feel like it's important in that regard to have people who actually like care and understand it discussing it, because so many times it's just people who are looking at it as an outsider, don't really understand it and are trying to give their points of view on it. And sometimes you're like, oh yes, they hit the nail on the head. But other times you're kind of like, you clearly didn't even like read a piece of /fic before being the expert on this article.
Exactly. And that's kind of like, now in my old age, when people ask me like, why do you like / I'm always tempted to say, like, to know, because I just do. Why does anyone like anything?
Yeah. I mean, there was this one interesting article on the HuffPost that was written by Claire Fallon in 2015, and she spoke to this professor of psychology called Deborah L. Tolman, and she was saying how basically /fic is a way of writing about sex without writing about girls, and that there's this minefield for girls to act on their desires, on their sexual feelings, even though we say everyone can do everything. Slut shaming shows that's certainly not the case. And so I feel like this was one of the better expert thoughts on this, where they're not necessarily explaining it away, but more so being like, it's so hard for girls to understand sex when even in shows where the girl, especially right now, like we've talked about in the past, like Riverdale and these other shows that exist that are supposed to be high school, but like I've never met anybody in high school who's doing the things that these people are doing on these shows, or like Euphoria and those sorts of things that like
what kind of high school was that? No, but I mean we shouldn't forget though, fem / exists.
Oh yeah.
Although not in emo fandom because there aren't enough women. But
yeah, there's so much.
yeah, I mean, it is worth kind of asking, do they need to be analysed differently? If they need to be analysed, do they need to be analysed differently?
Yeah.
And also, of course, that not only women write slash. Like, yeah, it probably is, it is female dominated. But I remember back in the live journal days, some of the most, like, prolific and respected Star Trek slash authors were gay men. Not many, but a couple. It's probably not really like useful to try and assign like overarching motivations to why people do it. Like people have their own reasons for enjoying things.
Yeah, 100%. I think that there is just such a focus on young girls being interested in this because again, people like to judge young girls, but also it's like that thing of, oh, we have to have answers to this, and it's like maybe stop catcalling 14-year-old girls and making them feel uncomfortable in ways where they're doing things that you now view as voyeuristic or fetishizing things or like kink shaming teenagers when they don't even know what a kink might be. They're just reading stuff because they don't understand anything and nobody's teaching them about it. So they have to find things on the internet to understand how anything is.
And there is, as you say, I think, a question as to why there has to be so much over-analysis of what girls do on the internet. Actually, like right now, I'm about to do the book proposal for a book on serial killer fandom. And true crime is absolutely huge. And the borderline between being a true crime fan and being a serial killer fan is kind of a blurry and policed boundary. And there's so much of the like moral panic over serial killer fandom, as though it's anything new. It's existed since Jack the Ripper. Really just seems to be like moral panic over stuff girls do online.
I mean, I don't know. It's all so interesting and intriguing. And I think also a lot of it is that there is this weird thing where, especially in America, this distaste of male intimacy amongst friends, where there is just this thing where we grew up in middle school and high school of if a friend hugged another guy friend or like high five for too long, they'd be like, no homo though.
Homo.
And so there is that whole thing where they're taught somehow, and I'm not entirely sure when this happened or how this happened, but there's taught that like there cannot be intimacy between male friends, but then it just sort of happens. And I mean, growing up in the pop punk scene, like my male friends were hugging and kissing on the cheeks and grabbing each other's asses and doing all the stuff that you're told guys aren't supposed to do. And it's like, well, of course we're gonna fantasize about these men in bands because they're doing it right in front of us. And we're taught that that's gay. We're not taught that that's normal friendship.
And yet, the valorization of the male-male bond dominates Western cultural history back to Greek literature. I mean, I think that when I was growing up in the UK, the no homo thing was predominant between boys, but I'm also half Arab, and in Arab culture, there's certainly until probably still is, like a big taboo against homosexuality as we would strictly define it in Western culture. But male-male intimacy and male-male physical intimacy, such as holding hands or cheek kissing, is entirely normalized. So I kind of had a somewhat confused perspective on that.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So I think so we've been talking a lot about fan fiction with fictional characters and then fan fiction when it comes to RPF or like real person fiction. And there's actually an article by Crystal Bell for MTV News where she talked to readers and writers of fan fiction. And so one of these people said, the active participation of writing fan fiction is an intimate venture, exploring the external conflicts and motivations of characters you only know from an outside perspective. So like we've talked a lot about parasocial relationships on this podcast, and when it comes to like using real people as characters, I feel like there's this element of the parasocial relationship where they feel so far away that in a way they are a fictional character because we don't know them in real life. We don't know them as real people. We know them as their stage persona or like the persona that they show up with in interviews.
Depends. I think that certainly for, people who are unqualifiedly celebrities, that is the case. But as I say, when we were using live journals in the early 2000s, like people in emo bands had live journals as well, and they weren't famous yet, so I think that's kind of different. But yeah, I think that's definitely true when a person is an unqualified celebrity, you know, like, I don't know, who do the kids, like, have as their big celebrities nowadays? Help me out. Well, probably, like, the One
like
Direction,
with Harry Styles.
Yeah, I like Harry Styles.
They know nothing about him. Like, he's just an idea.
Yeah, he's an unqualified celebrity. Everybody knows the image and I mean, he came from like X Factor or Britain's Got Talent or one of those shows, so like he was only ever a mediated television image.
So where's the line with, as you're just saying, like there's certain people who are like proper celebrities where they have very private lives, we don't really know about them, but then when we think about fandom, there was so much content surrounding these people, there were so many interviews, Warped Tour was a thing, they toured all the time, so there was like a more intimate connection there.
And I looked into that a lot when I was researching the emo book, and actually when I went back through the Wayback Machine on their early sites, the early websites are very amateurish. Panic at the Disco's first About Us page downloads as a Microsoft Word document. No joke. I could have made that website. Do you know what I mean? And the degree of personal minutiae in the blog entries, it doesn't feel like celebrity culture at all. I mean, it feels firstly from... And also, we're all kind of a little bit celebrity now, because we've all got, like, media images, haven't we?
Yeah.
Because of social media.
Honestly, as you were saying that, I was literally just thinking about that. I was like, because I wasn't on LiveJournal, so hearing you guys talking about it, it's like you just came across this person who just happened to be in a band that was really popular, but they're just like posting whatever they want to post. Like, I'm just posting whatever I want to post.
Exactly.
And especially now as social media has evolved, we're all presenting a version of ourselves that we want to share online or that we want to be perceived as.
What if someone starts writing real person fiction about us now, because we've got Twitter accounts, and, you know, I think about, like, what if I'm like... And we've all got, like, we all have a digital self now that is separate from our physical self, and a digital self that has, like, an online footprint across Twitter and Facebook and journal sites and professional sites, and we behave differently across those sites. So everybody now has some degree of celebrity in terms of there being a media construct of you.
This is crazy. This is blowing my mind right now. But also, I just feel like, so if I'm saying, like, we don't know Brendan Urie, like, in real life, but you would also probably never write fan fiction based on your real life friend.
Oh, no.
I feel like, I mean...
Well, I don't know, because when I was a kid, I used to write, like, funny stories about me and my friends doing weird stuff and just share them amongst ourselves.
Also,
but
I'm
that
sure
was,
if you
like,
have a
parody.
Yeah, like if you have a crush on someone, you're gonna daydream about them, but I feel like I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's somebody out there who's like writing proper sexual / fiction about somebody they know in real life. I don't know.
There probably is. Let's be honest. I mean, I'm sure, you know, when you think about like the range of weird stuff people do, that's probably like not even, like, no doubt someone is. But I think the question is, what is celebrity and where do you draw the line at celebrity? Because I think that if somebody is a genuine celebrity, whatever that means, there's an implicit contract and an explicit contract, but also an implicit contract that the public has some degree of ownership over your mediated persona, and you signed that over in exchange for the benefits of celebrity.
Wow.
But what if somebody is just in a band, but they're not the front man, and they have some social media in the same way that everyone has social media, and they just like play their instruments and stuff? Have they signed the same implicit contract or no? Like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
It's all interesting because, I mean, Jenna and I have been also looking into that idea of what it means when you're not the front man of a band, especially in regards to just women in bands and how they get overlooked and all that. But also, I feel like it's really interesting in acknowledging the difference between like an A-list celebrity and then these like emo pop punk bands, because there's /fic of like All Time Low, there's /fic of like The Main, of Mayday Parade, all these people who feel more accessible because they're famous within a bubble. Like, they can go to Disney World and not get celebrity treatment, you know?
Yeah. I mean, some people would call it subcultural celebrity. Like, you have celebrity within a specific subculture, and if you're a member of that subculture, you know who that person is. Like, I would say there are academic celebrities. Like, within the subculture of academia, there are people who are celebrities. And if you want to go and find out a bunch of information about that, do you know what? Somebody actually did make a fanzine for the academic Judith Butler. That just reminded me of it. It was called Judy. I don't know what was in there because I never saw it. But it just goes to show that, like, anytime you get a degree of celebrity within a subcultural sphere, like, it could happen, you know?
Whoa.
Yeah, and I feel like that's also why these emo bands specifically were kind of more understanding and more empathetic about slash fic, and more so why they would kind of not necessarily dodge the media questions about it, but play into it, be like, oh, whatever, because they know that their fans know them to a certain degree, where I feel like to them it might not feel as much crossing the line because it's like, oh, well, we're kind of feeding into it anyway, so
yeah,
it's not their fault. But meanwhile, when it comes to real celebrity, I feel like that's where the line changes, and there's like the shift of where it can be very uncomfortable and not nice for them, because it's like they are so aware that these people don't know who they are at all, and yet these fans are like, no, I know who you are, and I know that you definitely are like fucking this other member of your band. And they're like, what?
I mean, from a slightly different angle on that, I think that, at least from what I've seen in band fandom, people who read and write slash fic are very, very aware that what they're writing about is not a real person. It's a mediated construct. And I did this article called Real Person Fiction as Digital Fiction, which is about how, like, digital fiction has these different levels of engaging with fiction and reality, because everybody, like, has a digitized self. And it seems to me like maybe this is changing now, actually, with it being more normalized with the younger generation and things like Archive of Our Own, but definitely, like, in the live journal days, people were very knowing and very explicit about the fact that what they're using as a character is a mediated construct of a person who also exists.
Yeah, I mean, we found a couple of interesting articles that sort of talked about the different avenues of fan fiction readers and writers, and I feel like you're definitely correct in that most of these writers are very much like aware that they've created a fictionalized version of this. But I think that where this line gets crossed and why I get so frustrated with something that I loved and that really helped me just figure out who I am as a person growing up in reading fanfic and slash fic in general, that sort of muddied the waters and muddied my idea of it, was when people started shipping Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson together and created the Larry Stylinson ship, because this turned something that was so beautiful and helpful into something toxic, I think, in a lot of ways. And while I can understand where a lot of these girls are coming from, because there is undeniable chemistry between these two men, like, and at the point teen boys, in regards to Harry and Louis, it got to the point where it was even affecting their relationship, because fans were so adamant that this was true and that it only was a matter of time that it was going to be proven as such. And because of that, it became this thing that overpowered everything. Whereas in other ships, most of the writers and most of the people that read it are kind of like, this is just me fantasizing. This is me being aware that they act a certain way or do a certain thing because that's just who they are. And like, me writing this is making me feel like I have the representation that I don't have. Meanwhile, there's countless articles about how, so there was this one article on Vox by Aja Romano where they spoke to people who write this fanfic and all this sort of stuff, and they were talking about how there is that term like tin hatting, where people are just kind of turning this into conspiracy theorists, but that people in the Larry fandom think that everybody who doesn't think that Larry is real are the tin hat people. And so it's become this almost QAnon level delusion that has broken apart two people who were best friends, because Louis has been asked about the Harry situation since 2012. So he did an interview with a Tumblr blog called Tumblr Storyboard in 2012, where he was asked about this, and he goes, this is a subject that was funny at first, but now is actually hard to deal with as I'm in a relationship. Me and Harry are best friends. People look into our every move. It's actually affecting the way that Harry and I are in public. He's like, we want to joke around, but there seems to be a different rumor every time we do anything. I act the same with Harry as I do with any of the other boys. And so that's in 2012. And then you can go on to 2017, where he's interviewed for The Sun with Dan Wooten, and he is in a relationship with this girl called Eleanor, and they're publicly dating. And he's basically saying how the Larry Stylinson fandom is being super disrespectful to his girlfriend, and they're like not being understanding. And he goes, so I'm being really protective of my relationship and about the people I love, and yet these fans are still being like this. And he goes on to say how it created this atmosphere between the two of us, meaning him and Harry, where everyone was looking into everything we did. It took away the vibe you get off anyone. It made everything, I think, on both fences a little bit more unapproachable. I think it shows that it was never anything real, if I can use that word, which is just like, it's heartbreaking because these two friends who just wanted to be friends and act however they wanted around each other felt so much under a microscope that they're like, we can't even stand near each other. And yet fans are like, oh, when you signed your contract, you said that like you wouldn't be in a gay relationship with other people in the band. And so your management is stopping you from having true love. And they believe it. They fully believe it. And it's become this point where it's like
that's not slash fiction, that's just harassment, you know. Like I think I definitely agree with you that there's a big difference between like slash fic, as I say, which I mean I've never seen that in any fandom that I've never
seen it anywhere else except for this specific ship.
Every fandom that I have ever been in has been really explicit about the fact that like RPS is about fictional constructions of people who also happen to exist and has nothing to do with said people. But when you start pushing it onto like people via Twitter or whatever, no, that's just harassment, you know. That's not fanfic anymore. That's something else. And I remember actually when when people first started to talk about real person slash in academia, because it was one of the last areas that kind of people started talking about freely. They were like, well, how would you feel if someone wrote about you? And I just remember thinking, well, I wouldn't care. I just wouldn't want to read it, you know. It wouldn't bother me. I just wouldn't want to like see or engage with it, you know.
Yeah, and I feel like that seems to be how most people feel, because I mean Graham Norton all the time is being like, oh, have you seen this fanfic of like your character and this character being in a relationship? Well, I guess also in that regard it's not really them, it's a character that they play, it's their face, you know. But it's still that thing where like a lot of actors kind of think it's funny or kind of cute and like are like, oh, like whatever makes you happy, it's not hurting me, do whatever you want, you know? And so I think it is just really interesting and crazy that we do have this one specific ship and like just the conversation of it all that became so incredibly toxic that I think it also has made people kind of, especially people who are One Direction fans who have left the fandom or even are still in it and like other artists and stuff, it makes it harder to kind of be okay with reading any other slash fic because of how toxic the Larry Stylinson of it all became, because you're like, oh, what if it's going to be like this elsewhere?
I think in emo it's kind of like that ship has sailed, because people in emo bands like to read their own and tweet about it or like write it sometimes, which is just kind of they've jumped the shark there, to be honest. Kind of, like making it like, I remember when Jared Way made a live tweet of his reading of some notorious
the Brendan Urie like milk one.
And he was like, well, that actually was not as, which was my reaction as well. Like, you know, people said it was so like shocking. It's like, is that it? Like, I was expecting more, you know, like, that's a lot less shocking than it was sold as, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's this thing where it's like, in the grand scheme of things, slash fic is completely healthy and normal to read and to write and to be a part of that subculture. But unfortunately, there is just like one glaring thing on its record that has, I think, confused a lot of people. Most of the time fans write this being like, this person is never going to read this. And it's most of the time not something that should affect the person that they've written about. And as we've said, people in emo scenes read it. They're kind of like, this is fun. Do what you want.
Let me just read this.
And so I feel like there definitely is the constant questioning of like, why does fan fiction exist? How do people feel about this? All these things, because again, as we said at the start, like people just like to question things that girls like, but also people automatically assume that fangirls fit a certain age demographic, which is not true at all, because anybody of any age can be a fangirl. And so it's just a thing that people sort of focused on, where it's like, oh, girls read this, girls do this, in order to diminish it, when really like the amount of books that people read that were once fanfic that people don't realize were once fanfic is crazy to an extent, because so many like romance novels or other things were taken from fanfic.
Let's not forget, you know, that until the invention of copyright for text, the idea of writing about an original character was completely foreign. All people wrote about was characters that already existed until like 1600. Copyright wasn't legislated until 1710, but the idea of original characters or like doesn't even appear until like 1600. So like all of literature is fan fiction until then, you know.
I mean, Shakespeare literally did like fanfic of all the kings. So like...
if you go on Wikipedia, it says that the first real person fiction is attributable to Shakespeare, which is not true at all. Because what about everyone that came before Shakespeare? Well, actually, no, that isn't quite true. What I said about original characters not being a thing, because they were like in Chaucer and so on. But mostly people wrote about stock characters, myths, legends, people that already had like a body of literature and devoted to them. And the idea that you would want to read about some guy I just made up is like a comparatively modern idea, because people wanted to read about characters that they already knew and had like an established body of stuff about them, and they wanted to see an interpretation about them. The idea of like, oh, this is a book about a guy that I made up, that's the historical anomaly, not the rest of it.
Oh my god. It's so funny thinking about how like narratives change because we think that we're becoming more advanced in a lot of ways, and like now we're doing things that were so common back in the ye old days, and people are like, it's weird that you're writing stories about real people, and it's like, okay, but a lot of the times they're like we don't even know who they are because they're like super famous, so what's it matter? They're just a character.
Shakespeare did it.
Yeah, have you met the Greek canon? You know, like it predating the English language, which is what I always say, like, why do people have to act like something girls are interested in is something new or weird? Because it's not. The idea of copyrighted text is new and weird. And there's a lot of parallels between medieval ways of writing and digital ways of writing, and everything being like common. But like the point is, there's absolutely nothing new about any of this, and the suggestion that it is something new or surprising is just really a way of making stuff that girls do weird.
Yeah. I feel like that
100%.
I feel like that's what it really kind of all boils down to, is again turning something that girls like into just a weird thing for no reason, because in most cases we're not seeing a Larry Stylinson situation. In most cases we're not seeing this negatively affecting these people in real life. Like in most of the cases of real person fiction, either the people are completely unaware of it or they're backing it and they're kind of like, this is fun, you do you guys.
And when people like have the idea that fan fiction is like low quality or something, well, it's all qualities, isn't it? It's unregulated. It runs the gamut from the ridiculous to the sublime, like as you would expect from any unregulated form of work. And let's not pretend that there are not published books which are trash. Because they're even no matter how many editors they've been through.
Yes.
I mean, my favorite is when you come across any erotic fanfic that's written clearly by like a 13-year-old and they're using just like the weirdest words to like not have to say penis or vagina or like other things, and you're like, what is happening here?
Like, of course there's bad fanfiction, obviously, and also there's unbelievably brilliant and sublime fanfiction, and ranging from like 100 words to 600,000 words, you know. So like, so I mean, how can you make quality judgment about something that is the entire spectrum? You know, it just goes to show that they haven't actually looked at it. It's just an idea they have. But I think it is changing, you know. But isn't it ironic that some of the fan fiction that has been adapted for professional publication is not the best fan fiction? You know what I mean?
I know. Well, it's because all the best fanfic is like 100,000 words or more, and you can't really turn that into a book. Like,
well, I don't know, because
we can
hope. There's digital books now, so.
True. The amount of books that are available and out there that they have changed the characters from these characters that already existed to new ones, or even like we have the after movie series and book series, which was like Harry Styles, really mediocre Harry Styles, like
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
BDSM
Like,
fic.
none of it good. The stuff that like gets translated. Why is that? Like, I know
I think it's a lot because like there is all the hype around it because it's an easy read, it's mediocre.
Yeah.
And so everybody's talking about it, so people read it, and then somebody in literature is like, let's publish it because so many people are obsessed with it. And it's like, no, we're obsessed with it because it's bad.
I mean, some of the, the best fan fiction that I've read has been like multiple hundreds of thousands of words, and it's quite heavy. Like, it's a solid read,
Yeah.
And it's got a lot going on in it. So yeah, perhaps it's just like less commercial, but I don't know, it does seem odd that some of the stuff that has gone translated is just kind of
All right, well, Judith, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I've definitely learned a lot. It's been really fun talking to you. So we will have all of the links to like your works if any of our listeners want to go check out more in the description. And yes, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That was everything I hoped and dreamed it was going to be and more.
I honestly learned so much, but had so much fun with it too.
It was really fun and interesting, and just like her perspective on it all was so nice to have, because I think that we definitely could have had a really interesting conversation, just me and you, but having somebody in here who has studied this and really knows their thing, like that was so helpful to the whole conversation.
No, I was completely thinking that while we were recording too. It's like we can always bring our perspectives to it, but like somebody who like properly has studied this type of stuff is like just a completely new perspective that we wouldn't even know about.
Yeah, it also was just interesting having this conversation in this way because I have become so jaded on slash fic because of how horrendous the Larry Stylinson ship is.
Yeah.
That it became so off-putting of something that I never viewed as really bad. Most of the stuff that I read was not very like erotic in reading. It was very more just like two people who love each other. Very like coffee shop fanfic, like very just like quaint and adorable, gentle. And like somebody solidifying my thoughts that certain people loved each other sort of thing. But it is just really interesting when speaking to somebody who's like really studied this and obviously more focusing on the emo realm of things, where they were so accepting and still are really accepting of slash fic subculture of it all, that there aren't usually that many ramifications to the celebrities of slash fiction existing. But because of Harry and Louis and how clearly fucked off Louis is about this, like I was just like, everybody must feel horrible that slash fiction exists. Like it really changed my viewpoint on this, and doing the research for this episode and also just continuously trying to get you to want to talk about this. I feel like it made me acknowledge again that that's not the case. This isn't a negative thing like Larry Stylinson has convinced me that it was for a while.
It's like Judith mentioned this earlier of, in a way, the bands were kind of perpetuating it, but they weren't necessarily doing it with the intention of the slash fiction like continuing. But in a way, there's this dynamic between like the artists, the quote unquote music industry, and fans, where like them doing stuff like this or them encouraging relationships, and when I mean encouraging, literally could just be acting the way they are, then kind of fuels the fandom. But in a way, when the fandom is fed in this way, it grows. The fandom grows. It becomes more popular. It becomes a bigger thing. And so it's kind of like a cycle of, like we said, which came first. But also with that being an attractor to so many fans as a way for them to participate in fandom, it just grows the overall culture around said genre or band.
Yeah. I feel like it definitely can in some ways bring fandom closer together, especially when the fans are fully aware, like, oh, this is fictional, this is my idea, this is me taking something that they're already doing and running with it, or this is me creating something out of whatever they feel needs to be. Because I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's just people trying to have a creative outlet in a way that makes them feel seen and heard and more comfortable in a lot of ways. And I think that that's really the beautiful thing, specifically about slash fic, but just about fan fiction in general, is that it creates this world where you can feel closer to an artist without it being like unsafe or uncomfortable, because as we've talked about in our parasocial relationship things, we have seen people stalk people or just become a bit crazy in a lot of ways. And I feel like fan fiction is a really healthy way to have a parasocial relationship with a celebrity, as long as it doesn't get to the point where you think that the people who are creating conspiracies are the ones who are like well aware that Harry and Louis both have only publicly dated females, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it is like, in a way, like, if you take fanfic out of the equation, everyone experiences their parasocial relationships differently. And that literally could just be like making collages of photos of your fave and like daydreaming about pretending to like go on a date with them or pretend, I don't know, whatever it is you're daydreaming about. But like fanfic is a way to like put that into like words specifically. And it's just like exploring that parasocial relationship in a different way.
I mean, the amount of really crappy fanfic I personally wrote about McFly, and specifically meeting Dougie Pointer on an airplane, because that's my favorite trope in fanfic, where the main character is like a cool 20-something-year-old that I wish that I was at the age of like 15 or whatever. Right. And that just like helped me really understand like my crush and my parasocial relationship with this artist and all that stuff. And so it's like coming from the perspective of somebody who was writing really mediocre fanfic. And so I feel like it is like a very healthy way to have a parasocial relationship until it gets to the point where there are real life ramifications and these artists are like, you're ruining my whole life.
Yeah. It's also just that like fan to professional fine line of like, even if you're somebody who like works in the industry, you're like, for us, like would potentially be interviewing artists. I'm like, would I ever... Like, imagine, like, if you got to interview McFly, you'd be like, in the back of your head, you'd be like, wow, I definitely wrote fan fiction about you as a teenager, but that's okay. Because you're not going to be like, oh my God, I wrote fanfic. I mean, maybe you would, but like, you probably, like, there would be a line, right? You're not going to project your fandom onto somebody that you're meeting in real life.
Yeah, and that was also interesting about some of the articles we pulled and seeing these journalists speak to people who write this stuff who like very much so understand the line between the fan fiction idea of these people and like the real life version of these people, and who it's okay to share with and who it's not. Like if we ever interviewed Pete Wentz, I would be like, yeah, I read Pete Wentz fanfic as a teen, and he would be like, that's hilarious. Whereas with McFly, I don't think I would mention it because I feel like Tom Fletcher would judge me, and I don't need to be judged by Tom Fletcher.
Yeah.
But it's just a really interesting topic to broach and to think about, because there are lots of layers to fan fiction. And I just think that slash fic in and of itself is an interesting thing, because there is that focus on the females who read it and like the straight females who read it, when also there is a huge percentage of people within the LGBTQ community, both female and male and gender nonconforming, who read and write this stuff. But of course, as we said, like the focus always is on the teen girl of it all, because why wouldn't it be, you know?
Yeah. We always come back to like, oh, this is the way teen girls are being talked about, or this is seen as less valuable because teen girls are participating in it. When like even us reporting on that on our podcast is like, we can talk about the way teen girls are being demeaned because of this, but it does include other communities and other minority groups within that. But it's often just seen as a blanket of, oh, all these teen girls are doing this and therefore blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I think that was why it was so important and necessary to like have Judith here, who has studied this so much and so in depth, because she's so aware of all the other communities who take part in this. And I mean, that's why like part of the conversation turned into us discussing why teen girls are a lot of the focus on these discussions, and why we focus on that is because we were the teen girls reading it. So we come from that, well, at least I was, but like we come from that perspective of understanding and knowing, where a lot of people who write or talk about it don't. And so I think for our listeners, I mean, have you guys partaken in fan fiction and slash fiction? Do you partake in just like ship culture? You know, like, is that something that is part of your parasocial relationship with these artists? Because again, like we've said in our episodes talking about parasocial relationships, they're normal and just a completely common thing to have. And there should be no shame about it. And yet, again, here's another topic that people are trying to shame us into feeling bad about reading and being like, oh, like you kinky bastards. And it's like, why is it kinky reading about consensual male on male sex? Like what, why is that kinky? There's nothing kinky about it unless you are legitimately fetishizing it, which there are communities who do that, but most people don't. So it's just really in depth. So we would love to hear your thoughts on this. I could literally talk about this forever. So please come slide in our DMs on Instagram or Twitter. We are at Name3Songs, or you can talk to us personally. I am at Sarah_Fagan, and Jenna is at Jenna_Million. So thanks for joining us this week on Name3Songs. Until next time, never let anyone make you feel bad about your favorite band.
And you're never too cool to listen to My Chemical Romance.
Don't forget to subscribe to be notified when each episode comes out, and leave us a 5-star review. They really help.
If you want to find out more about any of the sources we referenced in this episode, you can visit name3songs.com.